When a fighter aircraft loses half its wing at 20,000 feet, the pilot has seconds to eject before the plane spirals into an uncontrollable death spin. There is no recovery. There is no flying home. There is only the choice between a parachute and certain death. But on April 1st, 1943, over the blood-soaked skies of Tunisia, Israeli Air Force pilot. Actually, let me correct that. Royal Air Force Flight Lieutenant James Ginger Lacey didn't reach for his parachute. He didn't bail out. Instead, with half his Spitfire's wing torn away by cannon fire, he did the impossible. He stayed in the cockpit. And then, defying every law of aerodynamics, every principle of aircraft stability, he chased his attacker across 40 miles of desert. This is the story of a pilot who refused to accept the impossible and the physics-defying flight that became one of the most extraordinary feats of aerial combat in World War II. Tunisia, spring 1943. The North African campaign was entering its final, desperate phase. Rommel's Afrika Corps, once seemingly invincible, now found itself trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and the American and British 1st Army pressing from the west. The Axis forces were being squeezed into an ever-shrinking pocket along the Tunisian coast, but they were far from defeated. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey was a veteran by any measure. At 27 years old, he'd already survived 3 years of aerial combat, including the hell of the Battle of Britain, where he'd become one of the RAF's top-scoring pilots with 18 confirmed kills. Lean, red-haired, hence the nickname Ginger, and possessing reflexes that bordered on supernatural, Lacey flew with No. 185 Squadron, operating Supermarine Spitfire Mk versus out of Souk El Khemis airfield in northwestern Tunisia. The mission briefing on that April morning was straightforward. Fighter sweep over enemy positions near the Tunisian coastal town of Cap Bon. Intelligence reported heavy Luftwaffe activity. Messerschmitt Bf-109GS and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s providing cover for German transport aircraft desperately trying to evacuate personnel and supplies to Sicily. The Allied air forces had achieved near-total air superiority, but the Luftwaffe pilots defending the pocket fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves. Lacey's Spitfire, marked with the squadron's identification codes, lifted off at 0820 hours. The North African sun was already climbing, promising another day of scorching heat that would make the cockpit feel like a furnace by midday. But at altitude, it was different. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, and a pilot could see for miles across the desert landscape below, a patchwork of browns and tans, punctuated by the occasional glint of sunlight off metal where armies clashed. The formation of 12 Spitfires crossed the front lines at 0855 hours. Below them, the artillery batteries of both armies exchanged fire, their muzzle flashes visible even from 4 miles up. Radio chatter was minimal, brief, clipped reports as pilots scanned the sky for threats. Every aviator knew that in this war, death came from the sun, from clouds, from anywhere your eyes weren't looking. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. The call crackled through Lacey's headset at 0917 hours. His eyes snapped to the left and above. There's 6 black specks against the pale blue sky, diving out of the sun. Messerschmitt Bf-109GS, the Luftwaffe's latest fighters, each armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm machine guns. Dangerous opponents in the hands of experienced pilots, and the men flying from Tunisia were survivors, the ones who'd made it through 3 years of war. The Spitfires broke formation, each pilot reacting with the instinct born of hundreds of hours of combat. Lacey yanked his stick hard left, feeling the 4 Gs of acceleration press him into his seat as the Spitfire heeled over. The two formations merged in a swirling dogfight, aircraft twisting and turning in a deadly aerial ballet where a single mistake meant death. Tracers arced through the sky, glowing lines of destruction that looked almost beautiful, like deadly fireworks. The sound inside Lacey's cockpit was deafening. The roar of the Merlin engine at full power, the rattle and bang of his own guns when he got a German in his sights, the crackle of radio calls, some calm, some desperate. On your 6, red 3. Brake right. I'm hit. Going down. At 0923 hours, Lacey maneuvered onto the tail of a Bf-109. The German pilot was good, throwing his aircraft through a series of violent maneuvers, a climbing spiral, then a split S, then a desperate scissors maneuver designed to force the pursuer to overshoot. But Lacey had done this too many times. He anticipated each move, keeping his Spitfire's nose pointed at the enemy, waiting for the shot. There. A 2-second window as the Messerschmitt straightened out. Lacey's thumb pressed the firing button on his control column. The Spitfire shuddered as 8.303 Browning machine guns hammered out rounds at 1,200 rounds per minute per gun. The combined firepower, over 9,000 rounds per minute, stitched across the German fighter's fuselage. Smoke erupted from the Messerschmitt's engine. The aircraft rolled inverted and began its final dive toward the desert below. But Lacey had made a fatal error. In his focus on his target, he'd violated the first rule of aerial combat. Never stop checking your 6 o'clock. Never assume you're safe. The first indication was a sound like someone taking a massive sledgehammer to sheet metal. A German FW-190 had dropped onto Lacey's tail unobserved, and its pilot had opened fire with devastating accuracy. The Focke-Wulf's 4 20mm cannons, far heavier than the Spitfire's machine guns, delivered explosive shells that detonated on impact. One shell missed by inches. The second struck the Spitfire's left wing root. The third hit further out on the wing. The fourth and fifth shells impacted almost simultaneously, 4 feet from the wingtip. The outer 4 feet of the Spitfire's left wing simply disintegrated. One moment it was there. The next, it was tumbling away through the sky in shredded fragments of aluminum, fabric, and broken structural members. The Spitfire's carefully balanced aerodynamics, the product of thousands of hours of engineering, were instantly destroyed. The Spitfire snap-rolled violently to the left. The sudden asymmetry of lift, the right wing still generating hundreds of pounds of upward force, the left wing now producing almost nothing, created a rolling moment that no amount of control input could counter through conventional means. Lacey was slammed against his harness as the aircraft tumbled. The horizon spun. Sky, ground, a dizzying rotation that would disorient even the most experienced pilot. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 19,000 feet, 18,500, 18,000. Every second of uncontrolled flight brought him closer to the point where recovery would be impossible. The standard procedure was clear and drilled into every RAF pilot from their first day of training. Uncontrollable aircraft means bailout immediately. Already, Lacey's hand moved toward the canopy jettison handle. The procedure was simple. Jettison the canopy, release the harness, push yourself up and out, count to 3, pull the ripcord. He'd practiced it dozens of times on the ground. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was pride, the fighter pilot's stubborn refusal to abandon his aircraft. Perhaps it was the memory of friends who'd bailed out over enemy territory and spent the rest of the war in prison camps, or worse, been killed by hostile forces on the ground. Perhaps it was simply the instinct of a man who'd survived 3 years of combat by never giving up. 17,200 feet. The Spitfire was still rolling. Lacey's mind worked with desperate speed. Standard controls weren't working. The ailerons, designed to control roll, were useless when one wing was gone. But an aircraft has other control surfaces. The rudder controls yaw, the side-to-side rotation of the nose. The elevators control pitch. Could those be used somehow? 16,800 feet. He was running out of altitude and time. Lacey stamped his right foot hard on the rudder pedal, simultaneously hauling back on the control column and feeding in full right aileron. Not because it would work in the conventional sense, but because it might create some kind of aerodynamic effect that would counter the roll. The Spitfire's response was immediate and terrifying. The aircraft's nose yawed violently to the right, even as it continued to roll left. The combination of forces created a bizarre corkscrew motion, part roll, part yaw, part pitch. It was completely uncontrollable in the traditional sense, but it was different from the pure death spiral. 16,000 feet. Sweat poured down Lacey's face despite the freezing temperature at altitude. His arms ached from the physical effort of fighting the controls. The G-forces, positive, then negative, then positive again as the aircraft gyrated, made it difficult to see, difficult to think. Grayout flickered at the edges of his vision. But the roll rate was decreasing. Somehow, impossibly, the wild application of rudder and elevator was creating enough disruption to the airflow that the one-winged Spitfire was becoming almost controllable. 15,400 feet. The altimeter had stopped unwinding so rapidly. Lacey's breathing came in ragged gasps, his oxygen mask fogging with each exhalation. Every muscle in his body was tense, every sense focused on the aircraft's behavior. He made tiny adjustments to the controls, feeling out what this crippled machine could and couldn't do. It was like learning to fly all over again, except he had minutes instead of months, and the penalty for failure was death. At 14,800 feet, the Spitfire achieved something approaching stable flight. It wasn't pretty. The aircraft flew in a constant 30-degree bank to the right, nose high, skidding through the air in a manner that would have horrified any aeronautical engineer. The airspeed had bled off to barely 140 miles per hour, dangerously close to stall speed. But it was flying. Against every principle of aerodynamics, with half its lifting surface gone, the Spitfire was staying in the air. And then Ginger Lacey made a decision that elevated this from a remarkable feat of airmanship to something approaching legend. He was going to find the bastard who'd shot him and make him pay. The rational part of Lacey's mind knew this was insane. He was flying a crippled aircraft that could fall out of the sky at any moment. The smart play, the only play that made sense, was to nurse the Spitfire back toward friendly lines and attempt a landing, assuming he could even get the aircraft on the ground without cartwheeling into a fireball. But Lacey had just watched WWII disappear to the east, and he knew exactly where it was going. The German pilot would be heading home, back to his base, probably already composing the combat report describing the Spitfire he'd destroyed. In his mind, Lacey was already dead. That thought ignited something primal in the pilot's chest. He'd be damned if he'd let that German think he'd gotten away clean. The Focke-Wulf was faster than a normal Spitfire, much less a crippled one. But Lacey had one advantage: altitude. While fighting to control his aircraft, he'd retained most of his height. The FW-190 had dived away to disengage and was now at lower altitude, visible as a small speck racing eastward toward the coast. Lacey pushed the throttle forward and lowered the nose slightly. The Spitfire's response was sluggish, wallowing through the air like a wounded animal. But it accelerated, trading altitude for speed. The airspeed needle crept upward, 150, 160, 170 miles per hour. Not much, but enough. The pursuit lasted 23 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat, where most dogfights were decided in seconds. Lacey had to constantly adjust his bizarre control inputs to keep the Spitfire from rolling out of control. His arms burned with fatigue. His wounded aircraft left a thin trail of fuel vapor from a punctured tank, and he knew he was on borrowed time. But he was gaining. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the gap closed. The FW-190 grew from a speck to a recognizable aircraft shape. Its pilot clearly had no idea he was being pursued. Why would he? The Spitfire he'd shot should have been a smoking crater in the desert by now. At 1,200 yards, Lacey could make out the distinctive shape of the Focke-Wulf, its radial engine, its broad wings. At 800 yards, he could see the German crosses on the fuselage. At 600 yards, he prepared to fire. The problem was that the Spitfire's damaged flight characteristics made accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The aircraft skidded and wallowed. The gun sight, calibrated for normal flight, was useless. Lacey would have to do this by instinct and experience. At 400 yards, the FW-190 pilot finally noticed his pursuer. The German fighter snapped into a hard right turn, the pilot no doubt stunned to see the Spitfire he thought he'd killed not only still flying, but on his tail. But the turn was a mistake. The Focke-Wulf bled energy in the maneuver, and Lacey, flying in a straight line, unable to follow the turn but maintaining his speed, cut across the circle. For 5 seconds, the German fighter filled his vision. Lacey pressed the firing button. 6 of his 8 guns were still operational. The .303 rounds, smaller than the German 20mm shells but fired in devastating volume, reached out across the closing distance. Lacey saw the tracers curve through the air, saw them intersect the FW-190's flight path, saw the sparkle of impacts on metal. The German fighter shuddered. Smoke erupted from its cowling. It rolled hard left, away from the attack, and dove for the deck, trailing black smoke. Lacey tried to follow, but his crippled Spitfire had given all it had. The aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall. If he pushed it any harder, he'd lose control again, and this time he might not recover. He watched the Focke-Wulf disappear toward the ground, trailing smoke. He didn't know if he'd killed the pilot or if the German would make it back to base. Honestly, he didn't care. He'd done what he set out to do. Now he had to figure out how to land this flying wreck. The flight back to Sukelkemes took 40 minutes and required every bit of Lacey's skill and experience. He had to maintain a careful balance, enough airspeed to prevent stalling, but not so much that the asymmetric forces would overcome his control. The damaged wing's drag meant he was constantly applying right rudder and aileron, his leg cramping from the sustained pressure. By the time the airfield came into sight, every other aircraft in the squadron had landed. Ground crews stood on the tarmac, shading their eyes against the sun, watching the lone Spitfire make its approach. Even from a distance, they could see something was wrong with its silhouette. Landing was the most dangerous moment. Lacey had to somehow get the aircraft on the ground without the asymmetric lift causing it to cartwheel. He approached hot, faster than normal, with extra altitude for safety. The ground rushed up. At the last moment, he cut the throttle and hauled back on the stick, desperately trying to keep the wings level. The Spitfire hit hard, bounced, hit again. The right wing dipped. For a terrifying second, it seemed the aircraft would ground loop and tear itself apart. But Lacey stamped on the rudder and brakes, and somehow, the Spitfire stayed upright and rolled to a stop. When the ground crew reached the aircraft and saw the missing wing section, several of them simply stood and stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. The squadron engineering officer, a man named Thompson who'd seen plenty of battle damage in his career, walked slowly around the Spitfire, examining the shredded wing root. "This is impossible," he said finally. "You can't fly like this. It's aerodynamically impossible." Lacey, still sitting in the cockpit, too exhausted to climb out, managed a tired grin. "Better tell that to the Spitfire, sir." She didn't seem to know. The official combat report, filed that evening, was unusually detailed. The intelligence officer who took Lacey's debriefing found the story so extraordinary that he included a sketch of the damaged aircraft. When the report reached higher headquarters, it caused a minor sensation. Engineers from Supermarine, the company that built the Spitfire, eventually sent a team to examine the aircraft. They concluded that what Lacey had accomplished should have been impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Lacey himself downplayed the feat in his view. He'd simply done what any pilot would do, refused to give up. He returned to combat operations 2 days later, flying a new Spitfire, and continued to add to his kill count. The war in Tunisia ended 5 weeks later with the surrender of 275,000 Axis troops. The Luftwaffe lost many of its experienced pilots and aircraft in the final desperate battles over the pocket. Among them was the pilot of the Focke-Wulf FW-190 that Lacey had pursued. German records indicate that the aircraft crash-landed at its base with heavy damage. The pilot survived, but never flew combat again. Lacey survived the war with 28 confirmed kills and a distinguished flying medal and bar. But of all his combats, all his victories, he always said that the half-winged flight over Tunisia was the one that proved what a determined pilot and a well-built aircraft could accomplish together. The damaged Spitfire was eventually recovered and sent back to Britain, where it was studied and then scrapped. But the story lived on, passed from pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, becoming one of those legends that veterans would tell newcomers to prove that in war, sometimes the impossible was just another challenge to overcome. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.